Chapter 6. Short Memories. Freya stood with her head flung back and her arms held high in a triumphant, admiration-beckoning stance, waiting with eyes closed for someone to congratulate her. After waiting for far too long without the faintest whisper of admiration, her arms draining of blood and her head beginning to feel light and dizzy, Freya dropped her stance and scowled around the room. Requiem, Uracil and Talis were unmoved, however, as each had his back to Freya and appeared to be preoccupied with Gio, a beaten and broken babyfoot player. Hands on her hips, Freya called out, "What's wrong? Don't tell me the fat one is off sulking." "No," Talis said despairingly. "He's just fallen through into another room. He really must go on a diet, you know." Without another word, Talis walked calmly onto the beanbag that Keo had just vacated, sank into it, and disappeared. Uracil looked concerned as he turned to Requiem. "Don't tell me Keo weighs that much now that he's breaking through stone flooring. I know Freya harps on about eating regularly, but I think she means little and often, not 4-course meals often." Turning back to look at the deflated beanbag, he added, "Really, you can't take the great baboon anywhere." "Harp on, do I?" Freya tweaked Uracil's ear, making his body twist awkwardly as he let out strange, pained, burbling noises. "I only try to impart my wisdom to you Philistines. Why do I bother? Well, if Keo has made a hole, the best thing to do is poke around with a stick. Come on." With that, Freya led the contorted Uracil onto the beanbag, where they too proceeded to sink and disappear in front of a truly baffled Requiem. Pulling himself together, Requiem made a snap decision to go with the flow. Standing on the beanbag, he folded his arms and closed his eyes in an attempt to draw on the strength deep within himself so that he could face whatever bizarre happenings waited below. An abrupt tug, as if the beanbag had suddenly been whipped out from under him, turned Requiem's slow descent into a sharp fall. Unperturbed, Requiem kept his arms folded and only fleetingly peered through his eyelids to judge the distance of the floor before closing his eyes once more and standing tall. He landed imperiously on the ground without so much as a knee bent or a sound made. Pleased with his cool descent, Requiem opened his eyes and realised instantly that he had not dug deeply enough to ready himself for what lay before him. Finding Uracil rubbing his ear was to be expected, but what he did not like was the sight of Freya swooning over Talis, hanging on his every word as they walked around the music room together. "How's the ear?" Requiem asked in a strained voice as he tried to distract himself from Freya's flirting. "Better now my close friend and comrade has forgotten all about me." Letting go of his ear and gazing around, Uracil too found himself distracted, but by far different means. "This place is amazing, isn't it? It has a very regal air about it. Just look at the carvings on these limestone pillars and arches. And how big is this place? It's simply enormous." "I'm surprised you even noticed the room. I would have thought its contents would interest you more," said Requiem in a preoccupied manner. Still looking aloft, Uracil was quick to dismiss Requiem's comment. "I'm secure in my relationship with Freya. I've got nothing to quarrel with Talis in that regard. It's only you—" Uracil stopped breathing. The hairs on every part of his body stood on end as the cold wave of adrenaline brought on by abject fear washed across his body. Uracil slowly turned his head to see Requiem giving him a sideways glare that could steal the fire from hell itself. "Oh, the instruments!" Uracil laughed timidly. Yes, amazing, aren't they?" Uracil hurried over to the plethora of glass cabinets and pedestals, holding every instrument that one could ever wish to play from across the eras and continents. He turned back to smile at Requiem and demonstrate how fascinated he was by them, but Requiem had already turned his back, his attention once again focused on Freya and Talis, who were now walking away arm in arm. Uracil needed to act fast. He had never before seen Requiem jealous, and being so of a vampire just didn't seem like the best situation in which to start. "Marvellous, aren't they? Each glistening with highly polished wood and immaculate metal, begging to be played." Sighing, Urisil added, "It appears, however, that none of the instruments held enough fascination for Gio, as he is nowhere to be seen." Requiem's muscles were tensed so hard in an effort to contain himself that all he could do was turn his head towards Urisil and nod in silent agreement. "He can't have gone far," said Tallis disparagingly, noting Requiem's body language and deciding not to comment. Freya, who was apparently less fluent in body language, simply looked at the ground and smirked as she leaned heavily on Tallis's arm. "It doesn't matter how far he's got. Those great flippers of his will lead us right to him." Freya pointed down to the rich red carpet. Large, oblong shapes could be seen where the carpet had been pushed against the grain, turning it a dark red. Freya still hadn't let go of Tallis's arm, and by now was almost draped over him. Urisil didn't know what was worse, the fact that Freya was cuddling a vampire, or the fact that the cabinets were misting up from Requiem drawing energy from the air as he desperately wrestled with himself not to explode. Laughing nervously, Urisil rushed over to Freya and, prizing her away from Tallis, tried to defuse the situation. "Come on, my dear," he said hastily. "I'm sure Tallis has much to tell us about this fascinating music room as we walk to find that flipper-footed baboon of ours." "Indeed," replied Tallis thoughtfully as he gazed at Requiem, whose eyes were still fixed on Freya. "This way, then. The rest of the music room is made of chambers. Your fat friend must be in one of those." "Oh, yes. I'd like to hear all about it. How do these chambers work exactly?" Urisil was unashamedly overeager in his interest in the music room as he led Freya by the arm, but it did the trick. Immediately, Requiem snapped out of his trance and regained his composure. Emotions back under strict control, he calmly rejoined the hunt, in mind as well as body. Tallis was explaining how the underground music room was broken into unique chambers, in which each of the different instruments could resonate perfectly. He was just in the process of explaining how several chambers could be occupied at once and not interfere with one another when he was cut short. His boastful tones turned to strained anger as he hissed just 2 words through gritted teeth. "The harp!" "Yes, magnificent, isn't it?" acknowledged Urisil innocently as he examined its carvings. The harp sat on a pedestal in a small white alcove. At first glance, it didn't look like a harp at all, but like a fearful dragon carved out of deep mahogany with a forked tongue protruding from its mouth. The fact that there were strings suspended between its arched wings and tail was the only giveaway that it was an instrument at all. Gio's footprints could clearly be seen leading to the harp. However, Gio's were not the only footprints leading away. There was a much smaller set of footprints that consisted of the ball of a foot and a tiny heel, as if made by a pair of stilettos. Requiem could all too easily guess what had happened. Gio's weakness for food was followed in close second by his weakness for attractive women. The way he had acted towards the woman on the staircase, and the sudden new tension in the air now, was setting off alarm bells in his head. Indeed, Tallis's body language was now not too dissimilar from his own when he had arrived in the music room earlier. Requiem was certain that he had more restraint than Tallis, and that things could turn very bad for all of them. Whilst Requiem was internally brainstorming scenarios to the incriminating footprints that didn't include Tallis's beautiful wife, Tallis spun on his heel and strode away, eyes stormy with rage. Freya looked at Requiem anxiously. "Oh, Gio's really done it this time. Come on, we've got to save him from his own stupidity and short memory." Urisil looked up at her in disbelief. "What?" she snapped defensively, looking down at him. "Nothing, my dear," Urisil replied wearily. "We can discuss how easily one can cause jealousy without thinking at another time. Right now, we'd better follow Tallis, hadn't we, Requiem?" Urisil turned to Requiem, but he had already gone. Afraid of what could happen next, Freya slapped Urisil on the shoulder. "What are you standing there for?" The last thing we need is Requiem losing his cool. Come on! Freya jerked him off his feet and they raced after Requiem. It didn't take them long to catch up with Requiem, who was using all his concentration to focus on Talis as they raced through the dark expanse of the Black Palace. Talis, having seen his pursuers, took to floating a short way above the floor and tore relentlessly forwards. Requiem scowled at Talis's diminishing image and glanced back at Freya, who was doing her best to keep up, but pulling the less than athletic Uracil behind was draining even her blistering pace. Requiem knew that they mustn't lose sight of Talis, not only for Gio's sake, but also to avoid being left wandering the dark secret passages of the Black Palace, lost for eternity in their soulless grasp. His determination renewed, Requiem reached back for Freya, inadvertently placing his hand on her chest. Startled, Freya gasped, but could not speak as the stale air of the corridors rushed past her. The passages became a black, featureless haze, haloed in a dim and blurred white light, and the three friends also rose to hover above the ground and hurtled after Talis. To Freya and Uracil, it was like being on the most extreme roller coaster ride imaginable. They were sure that the black haze was in fact the stone of the passages, but they had no way of knowing how close they were, and, more worrying still, the blurred light meant that they couldn't tell when a turn was upon them. They had to put utter faith in Requiem and accept that the horrible churning feeling in their stomachs with every death-defying twist and turn was better than the alternative of impacting the unforgiving black material of the Black Gate. Requiem saw everything in a different light. He could see that the great black wood double doors, with which they were so awestruck before, were now burning themselves into the walls and disappearing in an instant. But an instant was all Requiem needed to get through the doors and keep pace with Talis. He could almost touch Talis's fiercely fluttering cloak, but he did not want to stop him. They needed to find Gio. Uracil turned a green that would make his cloak envious as they jerked upwards. So sharp was the angle of their ascent that Uracil, his sense of balance now thoroughly confused, felt sure he was lying down. Just as he was about to black out, Talis stopped abruptly. With two people in tow, Requiem did not have the luxury of killing his momentum so quickly, and the cavalry tumbled over one another as they spilled into the orangery. The room was filled to the brim with trees, plant life, and, as Freya was about to realise, gold. "Where are you?" Talis snarled as he stepped over the tangled mess of Gio's friends and would-be saviours. Groaning, Requiem lifted Freya to her feet. From the burning anger in her eyes, Requiem knew he was in trouble, but he wasn't quick enough to avoid the searing slap that followed. "Since when does the fear of losing a race justify grabbing someone's chest? Do you see that kind of thing in the Olympics?" she said forcibly. Requiem stood speechless. Fortunately, Uracil was still focused on the task at hand. "Gio!" Uracil gasped, still collapsed on the floor. Requiem cast his eyes around the room, whilst Freya rushed to help Uracil. He found it hard not to be distracted by the room itself as his gaze trailed along the rippled walls of glass that encompassed the floor, and he couldn't help but gaze through the glass-domed roof, even though it was doubtful Gio would be so spectacularly high. Meanwhile, Freya put her arm around Uracil, who was still trying to get his breath back, when a sudden sparkle caught her eye. "Uracil, Uracil, you've got to see this," she whispered in an awestruck tone as she shook Uracil. This room is entirely made of orange gold. The paths, the framework, it's all gold. Look at it glisten. It's so pretty, so sparkly." Realising that he was losing Freya to her one weakness, Uracil pulled himself together. "How can you be thinking about gold when we have a missing Gio and an angry vampire in a room made entirely of glass?" "Uracil's right, but where is our dopey friend, and our Vex vampire, for that matter?" said Requiem as he walked ahead of them. As they stood there, not knowing which direction to take, Talis made himself known. "Stop right there, Akatsuki!" Talis's demand made every living thing that could move rush for cover. Everything, that was, apart from Requiem, whose sharp glance at Freya and Uracil forced them to stop their retreat and re-emerge from the bushes. Even the trees bent and buckled in an attempt to escape Talis's rage, only to bounce back and sway in a wavering gesture, as if calling Requiem and the others to their aid. "I'll lead this time," said Freya. Turning to Requiem, she quipped, "and you'll see that I'm able to do it without grabbing anyone's chest." Requiem drew breath to retort, to explain, anything to convey he was sorry without actually having to say it. But Uracil killed this idea with a raised finger, and they followed Freya through the orangery in silence. The orangery was vast, even by Black Palace proportions, taking up an entire top floor of one of the wings. It also made up for the utter lack of life in the palace grounds, with its profound abundance of both plants and animals. As they ducked under branches and brushed away vines, Requiem wondered if they would get to Gio in time. Just when he was about to blast their way through the jungle to speed their passage, Freya rushed out into a large glade with a single oak tree standing at its centre. The usual rules of nature did not apply in the orangery, as they moved from the Amazonian-like jungle to find themselves in a typical English country glade, where, hanging from the tree, was a delicate white swing, apparently in mid-flight. Holding the swing in the air high above his head was Gio, who was now as rooted to the spot as the great oak. His back to Talis, Gio was craning his head to make eye contact. "Stop right there, or it will be the last thing you ever do," said Talis venomously. Sitting innocently on the swing, with a mischievous smile, was the mesmerising woman who had so distracted Gio when they first entered the palace. "I give you my hospitality, and this is how you repay me?" The shrill in Talis's voice made birds take flight and animals retreat even deeper into the jungle. "Now let's talk about this," said Gio calmly as he lowered the swing to the ground and faced Talis. "I didn't mean to fall through the floor, but, as I had done, Libertina here thought she'd show me some more sights." Gio innocently raised his hand towards Libertina's exposed chest and added cheerily, "And they truly have been worth seeing." At this, Requiem put his head in his hands. Uracil looked to the heavens, and Freya mouthed the word, "Idiot." "I think you've enjoyed enough of the sights. Time you were going," replied Talis. It was clear to see that Talis was battling hard to maintain his composure, but the rampant jealousy racing through his veins was not easily controlled. Talis called to Libertina in a more subdued tone, "Come, my love, let us retire." As Talis turned to walk away, Libertina purred in a deep, velvety voice, "Jealousy suits you so well, my darling." Putting her arm around him and resting her head on his shoulder with a wistful sigh, they went to leave. "But," was all Gio could muster, raising his open hand towards them. Talis turned sharply. Flicking his cape, he yelled to the ceiling, "Our hospitality has reached its limit." "That can't be good," said Uracil, turning to Requiem. "Thanks for stating the obvious," replied Requiem sharply, as he glared down at Uracil. A loud peeling noise made everyone turn to see the rippling wall of glass that faced the U-shaped glade begin to roll back on itself. "I hope those gatekeepers didn't hear your comments earlier, Uracil," said Freya as she backed away. "Oh, I wouldn't worry. Odin's with them too," added Requiem acidly as he folded his arms in contempt. 2 grey clouds rolled in on the horizon of the blood-red dawn. But it was wishful thinking that these were just fast-gathering clouds. Romulus and Remus were winging their way towards them, and, in the claws of his feet, Romulus was carrying Odin. The orangery peeled wide open, and in swooped the stone vampires. Standing tall in mid-air, they spread their wings and arms wide to show their ominous size as they yelled, causing the glass to rattle inside its gold framework. The noise became unbearable, forcing everyone to cover their ears and cower. But this was not enough to block out the heavy thud produced by Romulus flinging Odin to the ground. Such was the force of his landing, a tidal wave of dirt flew over the group as Odin slid to a halt before them. Adopting a gentlemanly manner, Talis looked at Libertina and asked, "Shall we watch, my dear? This should be rare entertainment." Talis cast an ornate chair for himself and one for Libertina, and, with goblets of red wine, they sat down to enjoy the fireworks.